The St. Croix Falls Historical Society, located in the former Cushing Land Agency building, is dedicated to the preservation of the history of St. Croix Falls and the surrounding area. And what a rich, colorful history it is. After numerous lava flows and the glacier ages, the St. Croix River found its present banks, and soon thereafter, approximately 10,000 years ago, woodland Indians made their home in the area. Some of their effigy mounds can be found today near the banks of the St. Croix. The Dakota, a Stone Age culture later to be known as Sioux, were next to inhabit the area of the St. Croix. During the 1500s, the Chippewa, or Ojibwa, came from the St. Lawrence River Valley and slowly moved into this area. A decisive Indian battle occurred in about 1770 at the falls of the St. Croix River when a Chippewa war party, led by Chief Wabojig, engaged in a fierce and valorous fight with their traditional enemies, the Fox and the Sioux. It left the crags and crevices of the dells, littered with bodies of slain warriors, to be known as the Valley of Bones. Most significantly, it secured this region for white settlement as the unfriendly Fox and Sioux were driven out. The first recorded trip by a white man on the St. Croix River was that of Daniel Greysolon Sieur de Luth, who passed through in June of 1680. In 1693, Pierre Charles Le Sueur, a Canadian voyager, was sent by authorities of New France to this area as a successor to Duluth for the purpose of keeping the St. Croix Brule water route open to French trade, and in that capacity is believed to have passed through here. In the summer of 1832, an expedition led by Henry Rowe Schoolcraft traveled the entire route of the St. Croix upstream from the Mississippi. In 1837, Joseph N. Nicolet, French explorer and scientist, passed through here with a group of traders and Native Americans on their way to La Pointe by way of the St. Croix and Brule rivers. A voyager by the name of Sieur de la Croix is claimed to have drowned near the confluence of the St. Croix with the Mississippi River, and it is speculated that his grave, or the cross over his grave, gave rise to the name of the river. The Chippewa signed a treaty at Fort Snelling in 1837. The Sioux signed a similar treaty later that year. These treaties ultimately opened this area to white settlement. Almost immediately, Franklin Steele and a companion left Fort Snelling by canoe to stake a claim at the falls. Accompanied by a scow loaded with tools, supplies, and laborers, they constructed a warehouse and 2 log cabins at the foot of the rapids among the rocky palisades. On July 5, 1838, the 101-ton steamboat Palmyra left St. Louis loaded with 50 men: millwrights, carpenters, masons, lumbermen, teamsters, 36 laborers, provisions for 4 months, and tools and machinery for building a sawmill and shops. This group is accredited with establishing the first permanent white settlement here in 1838. They depended on the last steamboat in the fall from St. Louis or Galena to bring enough pork, flour, beets, clothing, etc. to last until opening of navigation in the spring. Often the supplies ran out, and they were forced to live on fish, venison, and what wild rice they could purchase from the Ojibwa. The arrival of the Palmyra in 1838 marked the beginning of the steamboat era on the St. Croix, an era that lasted until 1916, when the little gasoline-powered Olive S and St. Croix were the last paddle wheelers to operate regularly between Stillwater and the Dalles. The heyday of river travel was from 1880 to 1890. During a 7-month period in 1889, a total of 230 steamers reached the Taylor Falls levee to unload passengers and freight. The river was the sole source of supplies until the arrival of railroads in the late 1800s. Sandbogs and logs were constant sources of frustration for river pilots, to say nothing of the ice, which blocked river passage for about 5 months every year. A steamboat landing on the Wisconsin side of the river was the unloading point for steamboats and the loading point for wagons carrying the supplies on a rough trail which led up the rock wall of the Dalles, through the community of St. Croix Falls, and then in a northeasterly direction to the Clam Falls community about 40 miles away. Known as the St. Croix to Clam Falls Trail, it was the sole source of supply for the early settlers in this portion of Wisconsin. Shortly after the 1837 treaties, lumbermen came to the St. Croix Valley to take advantage of the huge white pine forest that covered the area. Logs were being floated down the river as early as the spring of 1840, but it wasn't until 1842 that the first log was cut into lumber at St. Croix Falls. Chever's mill, at the present site of the hydro dam, was washed out in a spring flood, and the river here proved to be too wild and unpredictable for the booming and rafting of logs, so those operations were ultimately moved further downstream, where lumber mills were built. Millions of board feet of logs were floated through here each spring from the pineries in the north, and the colorful river drivers with their accompanying wanigan were a welcome annual sight until the early 20th century. Wanigans were large wooden barges with a structure on top to accommodate the food, utensils, and crew necessary to furnish the meals for the rivermen, as well as to carry their tents, bedding, dry clothes, and belongings to the next campsite. This vessel is the basis for the name given to the annual celebration of the river communities of St. Croix Falls and Taylor Falls held each summer, Wanigan Days. The narrow channel through the Dalles was the site of many log jams. Their jams occurred during high water when the current was swift. If more logs entered the channel than could pass through, a jam resulted. The logs then piled on top of each other until the channel was filled. When this happened, the loggers would carefully remove the front logs until they found the key log. When this log was released, the jam would begin to move. Breaking the jam was one of the most thrilling and dangerous achievements of river work. As the jam broke, the crash of logs smashing and snapping could be heard for miles around. These jams were very costly to the lumber companies. When the logs weren't moving, crews had to be taken off the drive. No logs were getting to the mills, which were idle, and the companies could not afford to pay their workers. The largest jam occurred in the year 1888. For over 6 weeks, 200 men, 2 steamers, 2 engines, and many teams of horses worked to break the jam. Many people from all over the United States came to watch and take pictures. The logs were backed up to a point 2 miles above the falls of the St. Croix. Nevers Dam was built in 1890, about 11 miles upriver from St. Croix Falls, for the purpose of controlling the flow of water to facilitate the passage of logs down the river. This was a project of the St. Croix Dam and Boom Company, owned by a group of Stillwater lumbermen. When plans were announced for the building of a new electric power dam in St. Croix Falls, the Nevers Dam owners became concerned that it would ruin the floating of logs on the river. Steamboat owners, on the other hand, were elated because the new dam would stop the flow of logs and would improve the flow of the river for navigation. But the owners of the new dam were required by law to provide a sluiceway to permit logs to float through the new structure. Nevers Dam thus continued its original purpose until the forest was finally depleted in about 1912. Nevers Dam continued as a water storage and control facility under the ownership of the new dam at St. Croix Falls until it was finally washed away by high water in 1954. The electric power dam at St. Croix Falls was commenced in 1904 and completed in 1907. The story of its construction is available in a booklet on sale in the front office of this society. When it first went into operation in January 1907, it was the most important source of electricity for Minneapolis. After almost a century, it continues to produce an average of 128 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year. The history of St. Croix Falls is the history of the St. Croix River. Being at the head of navigation on the river, this community and its Minnesota neighbor, Taylor Falls, have been the final destinations for generations of early white settlers. From travel by canoe, travel by steamboat, and to transportation of logs from the pineries to the mills along the river and as far south as St. Louis, the river was the main source of transportation. And from power for early mills to present-day electric power, the river continues to be the main source of energy for this community. Although the river did not bring the expected industry and metropolitan dynamics, it has brought us something much greater, a rich history and heritage, and a beautiful place to live and enjoy the benefits, which only on the St. Croix, our river, can provide.